Welcome to IELTS preparation course, video number 5, titled Academic Writing section. Moving on to IELTS Academic Writing Task 1. In the first part, you are given a task based on some graphic, diagram, or pictorial information. You are expected to write a summary of the information provided in at least 150 words. The pictorial information given can be: number 1, a bar chart; number 2, a bar chart in the form of columns; number 3, a pie chart; number 4 and number 5 are line graphs in two different shapes; number 6, a table. Moving on to approaching the task, number 1, write what the chart, graph, table shows or provides. Number 2, mention what the y-axis and the x-axis show or describe. Number 3, write what you notice if there's an increase, a decrease which equals a decline, or a variation. Number 4, describe the highest rate or point and the lowest rate or point. Number 5, describe 2 or more additional points on the chart, graph, diagram, or table. Number 6, conclude or sum up what you have described in 2 or 3 sentences using other words. Here are some phrases you can use to expand your range of words or context. According to the given data, we can see that, based on the information given, we notice that, it can be seen that, it can be noticed that, looking at the chart, graph, table, we can clearly notice that, looking more closely at the given information, we can obviously see or notice that, in observing the trend of or for, it can be seen that, and this is used with line graphs. Moving on to some points we should know. The y-axis is the external vertical axis or line. The x-axis is the external horizontal axis or line. A plateau is the period of stability or relative stability on a line graph. A peak is the highest point on a chart. A fluctuation is an irregular shifting up and down in the level or value of something. Stability means that the level or value is stable or steady. And now, moving on to how to express changes on a chart. Number 1, to express a rise in the form of a noun, we can use a rise, an increase, or growth. In the form of verbs, we can use to rise, to increase, to grow. Moving on to how to express a drop. In the form of a noun, we can use a fall, a drop, a decline. In the form of a verb, we can use to fall, to drop, to decline. Moving on to how to express stability. In the form of a noun, we can use a period of stability. In the form of a verb, we can use to remain stable. Moving on to how to express a variation. In the form of a noun, we can use a variation, a fluctuation. In the form of a verb, we can use to vary, to show some variation, or to fluctuate. Moving on to how to express a plateau. We can use a plateau in the form of a noun, and in the form of a verb, we can use to reach a plateau of. And moving on to how to express a peak, which is the highest point on a chart. In the form of a noun, we can use a peak, and in the form of a verb, we can use to peak or to reach a peak of. Moving on to adjectives and adverbs that we can use to describe changes on a chart. And before we start, we should know that adjectives modify nouns, whereas adverbs modify verbs. The left-hand column represents adjectives, whereas the right-hand column represents adverbs. Let's start. Sharp, sharply, significant, significantly, clear, clearly, obvious, obviously, slight, slightly, gentle, gently, little, a little. Moving on to some other expressions that we can use, which are comparative and superlative adjectives. The left-hand column represents comparative adjectives, whereas the right-hand column represents superlative adjectives. Let's start. Higher than, the highest, more than, the most, lower than, the lowest, less than, the least. And if you'd like to express the highest point on a chart, you can use the maximum. And if you'd like to express the least point or the least rate on a chart, you can use the minimum. Moving on to an example for academic writing task 1. The task says, look at the bar chart given below and say what information is being shown in at least 150 words. And before we start the task, we should know that the chart given provides information on tourist arrivals in Brazil from the year 1995 till the year 2000. Now, let's approach the task and see how we can describe the chart and the information given. Looking at the bar chart given, it can be seen that it provides information on the number of tourists who came to Brazil during the period from the year 1995 till the year 2000. The y-axis describes the number of tourists, whereas the x-axis describes the years. Looking at the chart, we note that the number of tourists who came to Brazil was around 2 million tourists in the year 1995, whereas the number of tourists dramatically increased to become around 5,500,000 tourists in the year 2000. In the year 1996, the number of tourists started to slightly increase to become around 2.5 million tourists. Looking more closely at the chart, we can obviously see that there was a high increase in the number of tourists that reached over 5 million in the year 1999 compared to the number of tourists that was around 4,100,000 in the year 1998. To sum up, in observing the chart, we can clearly see that the minimum number of tourists who reached Brazil was in the year 1995, whereas the maximum number was in the year 2000.